So our evaluation process was quite complex. It resulted in massive amounts of data, as we've just talked about. Half of it was not able to be included in the analysis because it was just our evaluation team enthusiastically talked to over 1,000 people, and analysing all of that was a real effort and quite difficult. We could see results immediately from people who went through the training, and this has been documented through the UN Women's Gender Equality and Political Governance Program, that in some cases training actually has the ability to turn people's lives around, but in many cases that's just not enough. We also had 5 case studies around the region, so we followed the lives of the people in the different awareness processes to track them before, during and after elections. We did 8 regional focus group meetings, so we went to each of the 4 regions twice before elections to talk to the public and to our teams and after. We gave all of our electoral teams cameras, so they took photos and wrote stories and things from their own perspectives as to what they found worked. We did polling observations, so almost all of our team, our 39 teams, and there were hundreds of people in those teams, were absorbed into the polling observation teams because they actually knew how elections were meant to run. So they were then able to measure how polling was operating because they knew what was meant to happen, whereas most people didn't know. As I said, we interviewed hundreds of people, mainly the public, also people in the groups themselves. And we did a huge meeting at the end. We had regional meetings, and then we had a huge meeting at the end of all the people who had been involved. There was nearly 100 people who turned up in Port Moresby. And that meeting captured such enthusiasm at the end of the program. You could feel this movement had begun, really, because in Papua New Guinea it's very hard for people to form a movement because, it's expensive to get together for a start. So actually just bringing people together at different times to be able to talk about their experience engendered this, real desire to see things change in the country. We also had a reference group with a range of stakeholders that periodically asked us challenging questions, so critical friends. Some of the outputs very quickly this was all done, these 39 groups with $3.5 million and everything, all was done in 11 months. It was a huge project. It was done by 1.5 people, myself and a half-time admin person. And that was because we were able to gradually work out who were the key movers and shakers that wanted to be involved more, and we kind of brought them in and expanded their ability to help us, basically. I'm not going to talk more about that because it's off the topic. But we reached over 750,000 voters in that time. We couldn't collect, not all groups, despite our best efforts, collected sex disaggregated data, but there were 190,000 women, 250,000 men out of that 750,000. We produced over 6 million articles of media, if you counted them all individually, that were distributed and heard. We carried out numerous different sorts of work, teams traipsed around the country for days on end, talking in public spaces. Other people developed plays and moved around their area, a whole range of different methods. And if you counted up the number of months that they ran awareness over this 11-month period, in total it was 230 months of people time in running this stuff. Even so, it was the tip of the iceberg, just the tip of the iceberg, because the country is so vast and so rugged. Some of the key findings from the case studies showed that in Chimbu, for example, people felt very strongly there was a reduction of what are called campaign houses. So every candidate has its own sort of place, a custom-built place where people meet, and this is really the site of where a lot of electoral fraud happens. So there's a lot of money giving. There's also a lot of sexual practices linked to campaign houses. And part of our awareness dealt with HIV/AIDS, because in the same way there's a big spike of violence against women, there's also a big chance of transmission of the virus, because there's a lot of mobility and a lot of money in the country. and sex is tied up with politics in PNG, well and truly. So the reduction in campaign houses was actually an amazing thing to have happened, because people told us they were frightened to go to these in case they got sucked into some of this behaviour and caught the virus, in fact. Women in the Chimbu area were able to establish and lobbied the Electoral Commission for women-only polling stations, because they felt that, you know, women are pushed into voting in all sorts of ways, and that if they had their own space to vote, they would be able to do that more safely. In reality, the Electoral Commission wasn't able to institute that effectively at that time, and I saw most of those polling stations being used either as beds for the police, because they're cardboard things that unwind, so the police were using them to sleep on, or, I was saying earlier to someone that there would be one polling station for the men, and one candidate had captured that. The other polling station was captured by another candidate, and they had all of their clans and families lined up behind those two polling stations. So, it wasn't women only at all, it was just captured by politicians. Still, that was then instituted better in the 2012 elections. I didn't see those elections. I'd be interested to hear from you, Dame Carol, whether it worked or not. But the point is, it was women's agency, collective women's advocacy that, put this option to the Commission, who listened. In Southern Highlands Province, where elections had failed in the previous time, there was a great deal of violence. One of the teams that we had contracted, some of the members of that team had been involved in that violence in 2002. They'd run guns, basically. They became so committed to clean elections that they went back after months of walking around the mountains of the Highlands talking to their colleague, family and clan and others. And they went back and they cleaned the roll in their area. They cleaned it from 17,000 names down to 10,000 names by calling the whole community together and reading through everyone's names and saying, we're sure this person is a baby. I don't think they should be on the roll. And getting community verification of that process. So, and they got, their lives were threatened in doing that work, but they did it nevertheless. So there was clear changes in their behaviour because of participation. Face-to-face contact was absolutely the key. Although we'd done all of this media work, we found that by itself it just did not cut it. So we'd spent a fortune on weekly one-page ads in the newspapers in Port Moresby saying, there is a new role, please go and re-enrol. And yet hardly anyone knew there was a new role. So this was in the more educated areas where the media was more likely to work. So unless it was used in conjunction with face-to-face dialogue, it was dead in the water. We found in our sample of over 1,000 that only 7% had access to any of that media anyway. We also found that, I'll just move on. We found that repeated messages by different groups, the same kinds of messages, but done by different groups in the same region, to get a critical mass of people saying the same things, different people, was more likely to work. And it was partly because of this kind of cultural view that suddenly it was acceptable to say women should be able to vote freely. So that critical mass mattered. At the end of it, there was a huge demand for ongoing public awareness like this. And that was, the key finding. Everyone said, these are long-term changes. Some little things can happen now, but basically, and this is a quote, big man politics, democracy at gunpoint, patriarchal culture, ethnic and community consensus, and personal affiliations take time to shift. So, it needs to be ongoing, long-term, and there's certainly a role for the education system, such as it is, to be taking these messages, educating children about what's expected. Lastly, I was trying to reflect on the nature of participation. Why was that important? What I found was my own feeling about this. This is hard to measure because we didn't measure these things, but my feeling is that elections in PNG have a real energy that can be used for change. It's the same in a lot of war-torn countries. You know, they're often a time of terrible things, but also often a time where changes can be really kind of capitalised on. So that's where, you know, temporary special measures for women in Parliament have often been instituted post-conflict, where there's still all the cards are Islands Highway, which is a renownedly dangerous place at 2 a.m. at night to get to a place with a whole lot of people. And out of the dark, you know, seeing all these people traipsing along the road, busily trying to get to the party in the next village. You know, for many people, this is the only sort of chance they get to mix around with each other and, you know, do things slightly differently. So there's a great movement at that time. I also think that, you know, for us, the participatory element was people gave so much, you know, blood, sweat and tears to get out and reach people. They invested months of their time. Their health suffered in many cases. I saw one team who'd come down from the bush with boils all over their legs because they hadn't been eating properly for the last 7 months while they'd been away. And they'd done that because they really wanted things to change in their country. So there's this yearning for change that we must, you know, be able to support more in more innovative ways. So because of that investment, those very people changed themselves. They wanted to, you know, God, I've spent the last year out bush. I want to see some changes for that. So that contributed to the personal change and the changing of some of the systems. Exposure, you know, for our teams, many of them had been in very village people who hadn't really had a chance to mix with other people from other places. You know, this program brought them together. They heard different ways of living, different models of culture, for example, that they could draw on in their own situation. So just that exposure added to the change. And definitely I think that intensity and the desire for change was part of being part of what they saw as a movement, which I think as an outsider, I think may, you know, be relevant for the sort of clan family feeling. You know, people in the electoral awareness CSOs felt like they were part of something. And I hope you got that sense from some of those photos of the teams. You know, they had a great time, they loved it. And that enjoyment and feeling a part of something positive for their country was itself an incentive to keep going.